Monkey. The word sliced through the tense silence like a blade. Every eye in the street snapped toward the officer who had just uttered it, his smirk dripping with mockery. Officer Brad Halstead leaned casually against his patrol car, arms crossed, radiating the kind of arrogance that begged for confrontation. The man he addressed stood tall, unshaken. His dark eyes held a quiet intensity, cutting through the insult like steel through flesh. Everything about him, the tailored suit, the polished shoes, screamed that he didn't belong here. But not for the reasons Brad assumed. "Did you just call me a monkey?" The man's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something sharp, something dangerous. Brad sneered, his fingers brushing against the holster on his hip, a silent reminder of who held the power. "I did." His voice oozed condescension. "What are you gonna do about it?" The man didn't answer. Not immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle over the growing crowd. Then, with measured intent, he took a single step forward. His gaze remained steady, unflinching. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Brad chuckled, the sound grating like nails on a chalkboard. "Should I?" "What, you some big-shot lawyer? You think that fancy suit scares me?" The man tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. But before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Brad." A younger officer, clearly uneasy, rushed over, his face pale. "Maybe you should." "Shut it, rookie." Brad snapped, silencing him instantly. His bravado was loud, but it was cracking. He turned back to the man. "Go on. Say whatever you gotta say. Then get the hell out of my face." Another step forward. The crowd murmured in anticipation. It was as if the entire street was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Let's just say," the man said quietly, his voice impossibly steady, "you'll be seeing me again. Very soon." The air shifted. The weight of those words settled like a storm cloud, thick and heavy. Something had just happened, something bigger than anyone could fully grasp in that moment. And this was far from over. Earlier that day, the morning had started differently. Daniel Carter stepped into his new office for the first time as chief of police. At 42, he had fought for every inch of ground he stood on, carved his way up the ranks with sheer will and an unshakable sense of integrity. He knew what his presence meant. The whispers in the hallways, the measured stares, some curious, some doubtful, others outright resentful. Not everyone welcomed him. That was fine. He wasn't here to be liked. He was here to lead. Officer Brad Halstead hadn't been at the station that morning. Had he been, maybe things would have played out differently. But Brad, a seasoned cop with a reputation for pushing boundaries, had been on patrol. Loud, brash, dismissive of anything he didn't understand. News of a black man taking over as chief had rubbed him the wrong way. And though he hadn't voiced it yet, the resentment festered just beneath the surface. Daniel spent the morning settling in, meeting key staff, getting the lay of the land. He could already tell who was willing to work with him and who would need convincing. The tension was there, humming beneath the surface, but it didn't faze him. He'd faced worse before. By lunchtime, he decided to step out. He had always believed in walking the neighborhoods, seeing the people he served, feeling the pulse of the streets. It reminded him why he had taken the job in the first place. That's when he saw it. Brad had pulled over a car. The driver, a young black woman, looked visibly shaken as he towered over her, his voice laced with something more than authority. Something ugly. Daniel watched from a distance, his instincts kicking in. Then he stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was steady, calm. Brad barely glanced at him. "Move along. Police business." "I'm aware," Daniel said, stepping closer. "I asked if there's a problem." Brad finally turned to face him, eyes narrowing. He didn't recognize Daniel. The suit threw him off. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel ignored him and turned to the woman. "Are you okay, ma'am?" She nodded hesitantly, her eyes darting between them. Annoyed, Brad stepped in front of Daniel, blocking his view. "I told you to move along," he said, his voice rising. "You interfering with an officer?" "No," Daniel said simply. "I'm observing." Brad scoffed, eyes dark with irritation. "Observing, huh? You one of those social justice types? Here to play hero?" Daniel didn't take the bait. "I'm here to make sure everyone's treated fairly." That's when Brad's smirk twisted into something nastier. "Oh, I see what this is. Another monkey sticking his nose where it don't belong." The words landed like a slap. The street went silent. For a split second, even Brad seemed to realize he had crossed the line. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. What he didn't know, what he was about to find out, was just how big of a mistake he had made. Because Daniel Carter wasn't just another man in a suit. He was his new boss. And this was just the beginning. Brad stood there, his expression unreadable, as if carefully weighing his options. Then, without a word, he pulled out his phone and started typing. "What are you doing?" Brad's voice was sharp, defensive. Daniel didn't answer. He simply slipped the phone back into his pocket and offered a faint, knowing smile. "Like I said, you'll be seeing me again." The air around them seemed to crackle as Daniel turned and walked away, his composure an unsettling contrast to the brewing storm he left behind. The crowd that had gathered began to scatter, murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Brad remained rooted to the spot, fists clenched. He hated this feeling, like control had slipped right through his fingers. That man, whoever he was, had just stripped him of his usual authority with nothing but a few carefully placed words. What the hell was that about? Brad grumbled, turning to his rookie partner, Officer Jacobs. Jacobs hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Maybe you should let this one go, Brad. That guy didn't seem like someone you want to mess with." Brad scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. Just another loudmouth looking for attention. You see that suit? Bet he's some wannabe activist lawyer. Probably running to the media right now, claiming I profiled him. They're all the same." Jacobs didn't reply. He'd only been on the force for 6 months, and he knew better than to challenge Brad directly. But something about the man in the suit didn't sit right with him. He carried himself differently. He wasn't just some random civilian looking to stir up trouble. Meanwhile, Daniel reached his car, parked a few blocks away. Sliding into the driver's seat, he exhaled slowly, taking a moment to process what had just happened. He wasn't surprised by Brad's behavior. He'd seen it too many times before, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts and tapped on a number marked with a star. After a few rings, a voice answered, calm, professional. "Chief Carter," the voice greeted warmly. "How's the first day going?" "Eventful," Daniel replied dryly. "I need you to pull some files for me." "Of course. What do you need?" "Officer Brad Halstead," Daniel said, his tone measured. "I want everything: personnel records, complaint history, performance reviews. The works." A pause. "Understood. Anything specific you're looking for?" Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the phone. "Let's just say, he needs closer scrutiny." "Got it. I'll get back to you soon." Daniel ended the call and stared out the windshield for a moment, his mind already working ahead. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He'd learned long ago that anger alone accomplished nothing. What mattered was action. And he had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time Brad Halstead crossed the line. Next time, though, the consequences would be far more serious. Back at the station, Brad strutted in like nothing had happened. Slapping a hand on Jacob's shoulder, he flashed a cocky grin. "Relax, rookie," he said. "I've been doing this for years. Guys like that don't scare me." Jacobs didn't respond, but his silence didn't faze Brad. He was already scanning the room, looking for someone to brag to. Spotting a group of officers near the break room, he sauntered over, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You guys should have seen it," he boasted. "Some big shot in a suit tried to tell me how to do my job. Thought he could intimidate me or something." A few officers chuckled, though some exchanged uneasy glances. Brad's reputation wasn't exactly spotless, and not everyone found his stories amusing. But no one called him out. As Brad basked in the attention, the energy in the room shifted. Something changed. Officers straightened their posture. Conversations hushed. A few people suddenly found their paperwork very interesting. Brad, too caught up in his own story, didn't notice until the laughter around him died out. And then he saw him. Daniel Carter. This time, not in a suit. This time, in full uniform. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his presence alone commanded instant respect. Brad's stomach twisted. Daniel walked through the room with quiet authority, each step deliberate. Eyes followed him. Officers who had been laughing moments ago suddenly looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Brad's smirk wavered. Daniel stopped just feet away. "Officer Halstead." The room was so silent, you could hear a pin drop. Brad turned slowly, his grin faltering as recognition set in. Confusion flickered across his face, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "Yeah? Who's asking?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He let the moment breathe, let the weight of it settle. Then, with calm precision, he extended a hand. "Chief Daniel Carter," he said, his voice steady, unshakable. "I believe we've already met." The words landed like a hammer. The reaction in the room was immediate. Officers exchanged glances, some barely containing their shock. Others watched in silence, gauging Brad's response. For the first time in a long time, Brad Halstead had nothing to say. His mind scrambled to process what he'd just heard. "Wait." His lips parted slightly. "You're the new chief?" Daniel didn't need to reply. The truth hung in the air, undeniable. Brad swallowed, his usual arrogance suddenly feeling like a cheap defense. His face paled slightly as realization set in. Daniel leaned in just enough that only Brad could hear him. "We'll talk later." His tone was calm, unshaken, final. Then, standing tall, he addressed the room. "Carry on." And just like that, he walked away, leaving Brad to stand there, reeling from the moment that had just rewritten the rules of his world. As Daniel walked away, the low hum of conversation slowly returned, though it carried a different tone, quieter, more cautious. Brad remained frozen in place, his mind racing. His usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a sinking feeling deep in his gut. Hours later, he sat alone in the locker room, staring at his hands. He managed to avoid Daniel for the rest of the day, but he knew it wouldn't last. Their conversation was inevitable. Excuses, justifications, denials, he ran through them all in his mind, but none of them felt convincing. The door creaked open. Brad tensed. He didn't need to look up to know who had just walked in. "Officer Halstead." Daniel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, firm, unyielding. Brad looked up, forcing himself to meet his gaze. His usual confidence wavered. "Chief." The word felt heavy as he said it. Daniel sat down on the bench across from him, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "We need to talk." Brad swallowed hard. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything unspoken. Then Daniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me, Brad," he said quietly, "do you always call people monkeys, or was today special?" The question landed like a weight in the room. Brad's face burned. He opened his mouth, searching for something, anything, to say. But before he could, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then stood up, his expression unreadable. "Enjoy your evening, Officer Halstead." His voice carried a quiet warning. "We'll finish this conversation tomorrow." And with that, he was gone. Brad sat there, alone in the silence of the locker room, the weight of his actions settling on him in a way they never had before. The next morning, Brad woke up in a foul mood. Sleep had eluded him, his mind churning with frustration and unease. He told himself he'd handle whatever talk the new chief had planned, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was slipping out of his control. At the station, the atmosphere felt different. News of what had happened yesterday had spread. Brad could feel the stares, the whispers. Officers who usually greeted him with nods avoided his gaze. Even Jacobs, his rookie partner, kept his distance. He sat at his desk, pretending to focus on reports, when his email notification pinged. Meeting reminder, Chief Carter's office, 10 a.m. He glanced at the clock. 9:56. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stand, straighten his uniform, and make his way to the chief's office. When he arrived, Daniel was seated behind his desk, flipping through a file. He didn't look up as Brad knocked and stepped inside. "Close the door," Daniel said, still focused on the papers in front of him. Brad obeyed. The quiet click of the door sounded louder than it should have. He hesitated, unsure whether to sit or stand. After a moment, Daniel finally looked up. His gaze was sharp, assessing. "Have a seat, Officer Halstead." He motioned to the chair across from him. Brad hesitated, then sat. His posture was stiff, his hands clasped together as if bracing for impact. He cleared his throat, trying to project confidence. "Chief, Daniel held up a hand, stopping him. "I'll speak first." His tone wasn't harsh, but it left no room for argument. He slid a file across the desk. Brad glanced at it, but didn't pick it up. "I've reviewed your record," Daniel continued. "You've been on the force for over a decade. Commendations for bravery. Good performance reviews from some supervisors." Then his tone shifted. "But there's another side to this file." Brad's jaw tightened. "Complaints," Daniel said, flipping through the pages. "Quite a few of them. Excessive force. Unprofessional conduct. Multiple allegations of discriminatory behavior." He let the words sit for a moment before continuing. "None of it led to formal disciplinary action. But the pattern is clear." Brad exhaled sharply. "With all due respect, Chief, those complaints were baseless. People make things up to get out of trouble. You know how it is." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" Brad faltered, realizing too late what he had just implied. Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady but cutting. "Let me make something very clear, Officer Halstead. Every time you put on that uniform, you represent this department. Your actions reflect on all of us. And yesterday, what you said to me, that wasn't just disrespectful. It showed a level of arrogance and ignorance that has no place here." Brad shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "That doesn't make it any better. You didn't know I was your chief, so you felt entitled to treat me, and whoever else you don't respect, with blatant disregard?" A pause. Then Daniel's voice dropped slightly, each word deliberate. "Tell me, Brad, how many other people have you spoken to that way? How many other monkeys have you dealt with on your patrols?" The question landed like a gut punch. Brad's face reddened. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Daniel didn't look away. "You may have gotten away with this kind of behavior in the past," he said evenly, "but under my leadership, that ends now." Brad bristled. "Are you saying you're out to get me?" Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "No." A beat of silence. "I'm saying I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference." The room felt heavier. Thicker. For the first time, Brad realized this wasn't going away. This wasn't something he could talk his way out of. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying him. "So tell me, Officer Halstead," he said calmly. "What are you going to do about it?" To drown out his thoughts, but the noise barely registered. His mind kept circling back to the conversation with Chief Carter, the silent stares at the station, and that damn rookie looking at him like he was the problem. Was he? Brad scoffed at the thought and took another swig of his beer. No. He was a good cop. He'd done his job the way it had always been done. He knew how to handle the streets. He wasn't the problem. The world was changing, getting softer, too sensitive. He wasn't about to apologize for knowing how to keep order. But as much as he wanted to believe that, the unease in his gut wouldn't fade. The next morning, he walked into the station determined to act like nothing had changed. If Carter wanted to put him under a microscope, fine. He'd play the game. Except the game had already shifted. The moment he stepped into the briefing room, he felt it, something different in the air. Officers who used to greet him with nods or casual banter now offered tight-lipped acknowledgments or nothing at all. Even the ones who had laughed at his stories before seemed distant. And then there was Jacobs. The rookie barely looked at him, keeping his attention on the files in front of him. Brad clenched his jaw. So this is how it is now? The meeting began, with Chief Carter leading the discussion. His presence commanded attention, not because he was loud, but because he didn't have to be. "Before we begin," Carter said, his tone steady, "there's something I want to make clear. Accountability isn't a punishment. It's a standard. And in this department, we will meet that standard." Brad felt the words like a direct hit. Carter's gaze swept the room, landing on Brad for only a second before moving on, but the weight of it lingered. The meeting carried on, covering policies, community engagement strategies, and upcoming training sessions. But for Brad, most of it blurred together. All he could focus on was one thing. The walls were closing in. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he could outrun them. The fall of Officer Brad Halstead. Brad tried to push the tension aside, but the local news only made it worse. Sitting in his dimly lit apartment, a half-empty beer bottle clutched in his hand, he stared at the TV screen. Sources inside the city's police department report that newly appointed Chief Daniel Carter is cracking down on officer misconduct. Rumors of an internal investigation have sparked debate about the department's future. More details to come. Brad's jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened around the bottle. He felt cornered. He'd been on the force for years, played by the same rulebook as many before him, and suddenly, he was the villain? His authority was being questioned, his control slipping. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know how to regain it. The next morning, Daniel called a department-wide meeting. The briefing room was packed, a thick air of tension hanging over the officers. Some sat upright, attentive. Others, like Brad, slouched in their seats, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Daniel stepped to the front. His voice was steady, authoritative. "We need to have a serious conversation about the standards we hold ourselves to as officers of this department." Silence. "We have a responsibility to serve and protect this community. That means treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. Unfortunately, there have been instances where we've fallen short of that responsibility." Some officers shifted in their seats. Others glanced at one another. Daniel let the words settle before continuing. "I won't name names." His gaze, however, lingered on Brad for just a fraction of a second, enough to be noticed. "But let me be clear, this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Accountability starts now." He laid out new policies, mandatory sensitivity training, stricter oversight of body cam footage, and zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some officers nodded in agreement. Others exchanged skeptical glances. Brad remained still, his jaw clenched. After the meeting, he stormed into the locker room, finding a few of his usual allies. "Can you believe this?" he hissed. "He's trying to make us look like the bad guys. Like we're the problem." One officer shrugged. Maybe you are the problem, Brad. The words hit harder than he expected. His frustration boiled over, and he stormed out. The incident. Later that day, Brad was assigned to a routine patrol with Jacobs. The rookie sat stiffly in the passenger seat, fidgeting. You gonna say something or just sit there squirming? Brad snapped. Jacobs hesitated. I think you should take what the chief said seriously. Brad let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so now you're on his side? It's not about sides, Jacobs said quietly. It's about doing the job right. Brad didn't respond. He focused on the road, his grip tightening on the wheel. The patrol was quiet until a call came in about a shoplifting incident at a local convenience store. When they arrived, the store manager was holding onto a young black man who looked more scared than guilty. What did he take? Brad asked gruffly. A sandwich, the manager replied. But he didn't pay. And I can't let that slide. Brad turned to the suspect, his temper simmering. Got any money? The man shook his head, eyes wide with fear. I was hungry. I didn't know what else to do. Brad scoffed. That's not my problem. Hands behind your back. The man hesitated, glancing at the sandwich on the counter. Please, officer. I'll leave. I won't come back. I said hands behind your back. Before he could reach for his cuffs, Jacob stepped forward. Wait, the rookie said, voice firm. Let's talk about this. Brad's head snapped toward him. There's nothing to talk about. He's stealing food because he's hungry, Jacobs countered. We can handle this without an arrest. Brad glared at him. Since when do you call the shots? Since we're supposed to serve and protect. This isn't serving anyone. The words hung in the air. The tension crackled like static. Finally, Brad exhaled sharply and stepped back. Fine. Your call. Jacobs calmly spoke to the suspect, resolving the situation without force. But as they left, Brad's fury boiled over. You undermined me, he growled. Don't ever do that again. Jacobs didn't flinch. I did what was right. Maybe you should try it sometime. Brad clenched his fists. His grip on authority was slipping, and for the first time, it scared him. That evening, Daniel watched the body cam footage. His expression darkened. It was time to act. The fall. The next morning, Brad's phone rang. Officer Halstead, this is Lieutenant Ramirez from Internal Affairs. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending a formal review of your conduct. Report to the station at noon to surrender your badge and weapon. Brad's heart pounded. This is a joke, right? No, Officer Halstead. Fail to comply, and we will escalate the matter. The line went dead. Hours later, Brad stormed into the station, shoving open the Internal Affairs office door. This is your fault, he spat at Daniel. You've been out to get me since the day you showed up. Daniel remained calm. This isn't personal, Brad. It's about your actions. Ramirez cut in. You are here to surrender your badge and weapon. Now. Brad hesitated. His gaze darted between them, searching for a way out. Finally, with a sneer, he unhooked his badge and gun, slamming them onto the desk. This isn't over. And then he was gone. The reckoning. Brad turned to his last ally, Officer Givens. But when Givens was caught roughing up a teenager, Greg Robinson, the evidence led straight back to Brad. Internal Affairs uncovered body cam footage of Givens making a call after the incident. That call was to Brad. Under pressure, Givens cracked. He admitted that Brad had encouraged him. Brad's suspension became a termination. Givens was charged. Past complaints resurfaced. The department had made its stance clear: misconduct would no longer be tolerated. Weeks later, Daniel stood before a community center full of residents. The officers involved are gone. We're making real changes." Mrs. Robinson wiped away tears. Meanwhile, Brad sat alone in his apartment. No job. No allies. No power. For the first time in years, he faced the one thing he had always avoided: accountability. Months later, the city began to heal. Trust between the police and the community slowly rebuilt. Officers like Jacobs became symbols of change. Complaints were taken seriously. And Greg, now healed, returned to the basketball courts without fear. From the sidelines, Daniel watched as the boy laughed with his friends. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. The fight wasn't over, but it was a step in the right direction.